He dumped a plate of food on a man's head and fainted when he found out who that man really was. It was just after 7 on a Tuesday evening when Marcus Delaney pulled into the parking lot of Dottie's Diner in Springfield, Missouri. His old black Ford Escape still smelled faintly of cardboard boxes and takeout coffee. The move had taken longer than expected, and the last thing he wanted was another microwave meal in a half-unpacked kitchen. He wanted a real dinner. Something simple, something quiet. Marcus had only been in town for a week. To most people, he was just the new guy renting the small house on Maple Street. He'd nodded politely at neighbors, waved at a mail carrier or two, but kept to himself. That was his nature. Calm, private, observant. Nobody knew much about him, and that was fine with Marcus. When he stepped out of his car, the warm air carried the smell of fried chicken and fresh rolls. He took a deep breath, locked his car, and headed toward the glass doors. Inside, the diner looked like a scene frozen in time. Red vinyl booths, the soft clinking of coffee cups, and an old jukebox that hadn't worked in years. "Evening, hun. Sit anywhere you like," said Marlene, the waitress with graying hair tied back in a bun. She offered a kind smile, the kind that made strangers feel a little less alone. Marcus smiled back, nodding as he slid into a booth near the window. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through a list of tasks he needed to finish for work the next day. It was a quiet, easy moment, until the door jingled again. In walked Officer Brian Calloway, his police uniform slightly wrinkled, his radio crackling faintly on his shoulder. Everyone in town knew Brian. He'd been on the force for 15 years and carried himself like he owned every room he entered. Loud voice, quick temper, a man who thrived on being noticed. "Hey, Marlene," Brian called out, tossing his keys on the counter. "Got my usual?" "Sure thing, officer." "Give me a sec," she said, glancing toward Marcus's booth. That's when Brian noticed him. A face he didn't recognize. Someone new. Marcus didn't look up right away, but when he did, their eyes met for a brief second. Calm, steady, unbothered. Brian frowned. "Don't think I've seen you around before," he said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. Marcus smiled politely. "Just moved here last week." "Uh-huh." Brian leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Where from?" Marcus hesitated, then said, "Ohio." Brian's expression tightened, as if that answer alone didn't sit right with him. "Ohio, huh? Well, welcome to Springfield. We like to keep things peaceful around here, you feel me?" Marcus nodded. "That's all I want, officer." "Just peace and a hot meal," Brian gave a short laugh. All right. Just making conversation." He turned back toward the counter, but his eyes lingered on Marcus a second longer than they should have. The waitress came over with a glass of water and a menu. "Don't mind him," she whispered. "He's all bark, no bite." Marcus gave a half smile. "I've met his kind before." She raised an eyebrow, but before she could ask what he meant, her name was shouted from the kitchen. "Marlene! Orders up!" She hurried off, and Marcus opened the menu, trying to focus on the list of meals rather than the feeling of eyes still watching him. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, bathing the parking lot in a pale orange glow. Inside, laughter and conversation filled the air again, but the calm had shifted, just slightly, like the moment before a storm. But that quiet tension was only the beginning, because within 20 minutes, everything in that diner would change. 10 minutes passed. The smell of fried food hung heavy in the air, and Marcus had just started to relax. Marlene brought his order, chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes and green beans, then refilled his water with a warm smile. "You let me know if you need anything, sugar," she said. He thanked her, unfolded his napkin, and started to eat. But across the room, Brian Calloway was on his third cup of coffee and growing louder by the minute. He sat at the counter talking with two regulars, laughing too hard at his own jokes. His voice carried like a thunderclap, and though the diner was half full, everyone could hear every word. Then, without warning, his tone shifted. "So, what's that guy's deal?" Brian said, jerking his chin toward Marcus's booth. "You see how quiet he is? Folks like that always think they're better than the rest of us." The two regulars chuckled uneasily. One of them muttered, "He just moved here, I think." Brian leaned back on his stool. "Moved here, huh? You mean he just showed up and decided this was home?" Marcus tried to ignore it, focusing on his meal. But Brian wasn't done. He got up, walked over, and stopped at the edge of Marcus's booth. His boots squeaked against the floor. "You new around here, huh?" he said, already knowing the answer. Marcus looked up. His voice was calm. "That's right. Brian smirked. You from around Springfield originally? No, sir, Marcus replied, cutting another piece of steak. Brian tilted his head. What brings you here then? Work? What kind of work? Marcus paused. Just office work. I prefer to keep things private. That word, private, hit Brian the wrong way. He laughed out loud, shaking his head. Private, huh? We don't do secrets around here, pal. Folks like to know who they're dealing with. Marlene, watching from the counter, called out gently, Brian, leave the man alone. He's just trying to eat. But Brian ignored her. He reached over, grabbed Marcus's glass of water, and swirled it slightly, staring into it like he was inspecting for something. Then he set it down hard enough for a bit of water to splash out. Just being friendly, he said. Marcus's eyes met his, steady, unshaken. You should be careful with how you define friendly. That was it. Something in Brian snapped. The regulars stopped whispering. Marlene froze mid-step. Brian reached over to the counter, grabbed a fresh plate someone had just served, a steaming one piled with mashed potatoes and gravy, and in one unbelievable motion, dumped it right over Marcus's head. The diner went silent. Forks stopped clinking. Even the jukebox made a faint click as if it too had gone still. Gravy dripped down Marcus's face, his shirt soaked. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move right away. He took a slow breath, then reached for a napkin and calmly wiped his eyes. Feel better now? He said quietly. Brian scoffed. You think you can talk slick and get away with it in my town? Marcus stood up, slowly, deliberately. He placed his wallet on the table, took out a few bills, and set them on top of the check. Keep the change, he said to Marlene. Everyone watched as he walked toward the door. He didn't yell. He didn't even look back. The only sound was his shoes against the tile and the faint ding of the door as it closed behind him. Marlene turned toward Brian, her voice trembling. What's wrong with you? Brian shrugged, still smirking. He'll get over it. One of the regulars whispered, That wasn't right, man. Brian shot him a glare. You got something to say? The man looked down. No, nothing. Brian tossed a few dollars on the counter, pretending he hadn't just humiliated someone. But deep down, even he could feel that something about that man's calm reaction didn't sit right. Not one bit. But what Brian didn't know was that Marcus's silence wasn't fear. It was control, and that control was about to turn his world upside down. The diner stayed frozen long after Marcus walked out. Nobody spoke. You could hear the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the scrape of Brian's boots as he shifted his weight, pretending like nothing happened. But the air had changed, heavy, sour, thick with guilt that wasn't his. Marlene's hands trembled as she picked up the empty plate Brian had thrown. You went too far this time, she said quietly. Brian scoffed. Oh, come on, Marlene. He's fine. Just needed to know his place. People come in here thinking they can act all high and mighty. She cut him off. He didn't act high and mighty. He was minding his business. You're the one who couldn't leave him alone. Brian's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He wasn't used to people talking back to him, especially not here, in his town. He turned toward the others, looking for backup, but the regulars avoided his eyes. One of them, a truck driver named Dean Whitby, finally spoke up. You didn't have to do that, man. You embarrassed the guy in front of everybody. For what? Brian forced a laugh, trying to shake off the discomfort. You're acting like I beat him up or something. It was a joke. People need to toughen up. Dean shook his head. Didn't look like a joke to me. For the first time that evening, Brian felt something crawl under his skin. A faint, creeping discomfort he couldn't explain. He glanced toward the door Marcus had walked out of. The glass pane still had a faint handprint near the handle, like a quiet reminder of what had just happened. Whatever, he muttered. You all are too soft these days. Marlene sighed, wiping down the counter harder than necessary. You've got no idea who that man was, do you? Brian frowned. What are you talking about? She looked him dead in the eye. Some folks don't have to tell you who they are for you to respect them. He rolled his eyes and stormed toward the door. Yeah. I'll see you around, Marlene. You can take his side if you want. The bell above the door jingled as he left, his cruiser parked right outside under the yellow streetlight. He climbed in, slammed the door, and started the engine. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, jaw tight, eyes restless. He looked angry, but underneath that, there was something else. Confusion. Maybe even a flicker of shame. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his car just a block away, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. The gravy had dried on his shirt. He looked straight ahead, breathing slowly. He could have said something, he could have fought back, but he didn't. Not because he was weak, but because he knew who he was, and he knew what would happen next. He reached for his phone and made one short call. His voice was calm, professional, clipped. "It's me. I've been made contact. Situations confirmed. Proceed as planned." There was silence on the other end, then a simple response. "Copy that, Agent Delaney." Marcus hung up, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes. Outside, the neon sign from the diner flickered faintly, casting light across his windshield. Inside, his heartbeat steadied. He wasn't angry, just tired. But while Marcus was staying calm, word of what happened was already making its way through town, and by morning, everyone would have something to say. By sunrise, Dottie's Diner wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a rumor factory. In towns like Springfield, word travels faster than truth, and by breakfast time, everyone had their version of what happened. At Kenny's auto shop, the story started small. A mechanic leaned over a toolbox and said, "You hear what happened to Officer Calloway last night?" Poured food on some stranger's head. In public. Across town at Grace's hair studio, it was already growing legs. They say that new black guy mouthed off to Brian, and Brian put him in his place. But Marlene told my cousin he didn't even say a word. By noon, half the town had picked a side, some defending Brian, others disgusted. That's the way it went here. People didn't always care about the truth. They just wanted to be part of the story. Meanwhile, Brian sat in his patrol car outside the gas station, sipping his coffee and pretending the whispers didn't bother him. He could feel the eyes on him when he walked in anywhere now. Folks looked at him differently. Some nodded with awkward approval, others just turned away. He radioed dispatch. "Unit 12, all clear near Main and 3rd, he said, forcing a casual tone. The voice on the other end responded, "Copy that, Officer Calloway." "Chief wants to see you when you get back to the station." Brian frowned. "Chief? What for?" "Didn't say." He grumbled under his breath, threw the car in gear and pulled out. The road was quiet, but his thoughts weren't. Maybe the guy had filed a complaint. Maybe the chief just wanted to calm things down before it made the local paper. But still, he told himself he didn't care. He'd done nothing wrong. At least, that's what he kept repeating. Back at the diner, Marlene wiped down the counter, her face pale from lack of sleep. The booth where Marcus sat still had faint stains on the table. She hadn't cleaned it all the way. Something in her gut told her she shouldn't erase what happened just yet. Dean Whitby walked in, hat in hand. "Marlene, you okay?" She sighed. "I'm fine, Dean." Just wish last night hadn't happened. Dean sat down on a stool. That man, Marcus, he didn't deserve that. You could tell by the way he carried himself, calm, like he'd seen worse. Marlene nodded slowly. "Yeah, he wasn't scared. He was waiting." "Waiting for what?" Dean asked. She hesitated. "That's what I can't figure out." Later that afternoon, Brian pulled into the police station parking lot. The chief's SUV was already there, along with two unmarked black sedans he didn't recognize. He squinted at them but didn't think much of it, just figured they were city officials. Inside, the station was quieter than usual. Officers avoided his gaze. A few whispered near the coffee pot. Brian knocked on the chief's office door. "You wanted to see me?" The chief looked up, his expression serious. "Yeah." Closed the door, Brian did, heart beating just a little faster. "You know anything about 2 federal vehicles outside?" the chief asked. "Federal?" Brian repeated. "No, sir." "Why?" The chief sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Because apparently, the man you decided to dump a plate of food on last night wasn't just some stranger. He was on assignment here, federal business." Brian froze, confusion twisting into disbelief. "You gotta be kidding me." The chief shook his head. "No joke. He's an agent, full credentials. I just got the call. They want a meeting in about an hour." Brian's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You mean to tell me that guy?" The chief cut him off. "Yeah, that guy. You better get yourself together, Brian, because this isn't going away." But what Brian didn't know was that the worst part wasn't the meeting. It was who was about to walk through that door next. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the narrow hallway of the Springfield Police Department. Officers glanced up from their desks as 2 men in dark suits stepped in, no badges flashing, no introductions needed, the kind of presence that made the whole room stand straighter without a word being said. Brian stood beside the chief's office door, his palms slick with sweat. His heart thudded in his chest, slow and uneven. He didn't know what to expect, an official reprimand, maybe a lecture about public image. But when the taller agent looked directly at him, expression flat, Brian suddenly realized this wasn't just about image. The chief gestured stiffly. "Agent Delaney, this is Officer Brian Calloway." Brian blinked. "Wait, Delaney?" The shorter agent, standing behind Marcus, smirked faintly. "You remember him, I'm sure." Marcus Delaney stepped forward, dressed sharply now in a dark suit and tie, not a single trace of the quiet diner patron who'd been drenched in gravy the night before. His calmness was the same, but this time it carried authority. "Wait." Brian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. You're FBI?" Marcus's voice was cool, precise. "Special Agent Marcus Delaney. I've been assigned to a joint operation here in Springfield. We were coordinating with your department until last night." The room felt smaller. The chief cleared his throat, trying to hold composure. "Agent Delaney, let me say on behalf of—" Marcus raised a hand gently. "Chief, I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for accountability." Brian swallowed hard, trying to regain some ground. "Look, I didn't know who you were, all right? It was just a misunderstanding. You didn't—" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being." The words hit harder than any punch could. Every officer nearby froze, pretending to look busy, but listening to every word. Marcus continued, voice low but steady. "I walked into that diner for dinner, not to be humiliated in front of strangers. You made a decision based on your own bias, officer, and that decision says more about this department than you realize." The chief stepped in quickly. "Agent Delaney, Internal Affairs will handle this immediately. You have my word." Marcus nodded once. "Good. Because if I hadn't been who I am, if I'd reacted differently, you'd be dealing with something far worse than embarrassment right now." Brian couldn't move. His throat was dry. "Look, man, agent, whatever, I made a mistake. I get it. But you gotta understand. People talk. There's tension. I was just trying to—" Marcus cut him off again. "To what? Prove something? Show everyone you were in control? The only thing you showed was how quickly power can turn into cruelty when no one stops you." Silence blanketed the room. After a long pause, Marcus turned toward the chief. "I'll be reporting back to my superiors about this encounter." "I'm not here to destroy careers, Chief, but I am here to make sure this department understands that respect isn't optional." He gave Brian one last look, measured, disappointed, final, and then left the room. The other agents followed him out, their footsteps fading down the hallway. Brian sank into a chair. The chief stood behind his desk, arms crossed, disappointment etched across his face. "You just embarrassed this department in front of the feds. You better hope this doesn't go public." Brian's voice came out small, broken. "It won't, right?" The chief didn't answer. Outside, the two black SUVs idled by the curb, their tinted windows catching the afternoon light. Marcus climbed into the back seat and stared out at the quiet town that had already shown him so much in just a week. The driver asked softly, "You want to head straight to the office?" Marcus hesitated. "No, take me back to the diner first, because sometimes the best way to face hate is to walk right back through the door it came from." The bell above Dottie's diner chimed softly as Marcus stepped back inside that evening. It was quieter this time. No laughter, no chatter, just the faint clink of silverware against plates. Heads turned when they saw him, and conversation died instantly. Marlene looked up from behind the counter, eyes widening. "You came back." Marcus smiled faintly. "Told you the food was good." She exhaled a shaky laugh. "I saved your usual booth." He sat down, ordered coffee, and waited. No one else said a word. A couple near the window whispered, their eyes darting between him and the door, as if expecting someone to come storming in again. But the man who came in next wasn't Brian Calloway. It was Dean Whitby, the truck driver. He hesitated, then walked over. "Sir, I just wanted to say, what happened last night wasn't right." Nobody deserved that. Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Dean." I appreciate that Dean rubbed the back of his neck. "People around here, they see what they want to see. Doesn't make it okay, but it's what it is." Marcus took a sip of his coffee. Then maybe it's time someone showed them something different. Dean thought about that, then gave a short nod before heading back to his seat. Outside, across the street, A black SUV idled quietly. Inside sat one of Marcus's fellow agents, keeping a low profile. They weren't watching for threats. They were watching reactions. Springfield was about to learn that every action has a consequence. At the station, things were unraveling fast. Word of the FBI visit had spread beyond the walls. A few officers started whispering about body cams, reports, disciplinary hearings. Someone said Internal Affairs from Kansas City was on their way. Brian sat alone in the locker room, staring at his reflection in the metal mirror. His badge lay on the bench beside him. He hadn't slept. The adrenaline from last night was gone, replaced by a dull ache in his stomach that wouldn't go away. When the chief walked in, Brian didn't even look up. "I'm suspended, aren't I?" The chief sighed. "Pending investigation. They'll review everything. You'll have to answer questions about your conduct." Brian clenched his fists. "I said I was sorry." "Sometimes sorry doesn't undo the damage," the chief replied. Brian's voice cracked. "He's going to ruin me over one stupid mistake?" The chief leaned against a locker, shaking his head. "No, Brian. You did that yourself." He left the room, leaving Brian alone with the sound of the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Back at the diner, Marlene came over with a slice of pie. "On the house," she said softly. Marcus smiled. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, "You going to press charges?" Marcus looked out the window, the evening sun casting long shadows on the street. "No, the system will handle him. Sometimes the best punishment isn't jail. It's having to face what you've done." Marlene nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Mr. Delaney." He smiled faintly. "I try to be." As he left the diner, a few people outside pretended not to watch him. Some looked ashamed, others looked curious. But the message had already started to spread. Respect isn't something you give based on who someone is, but on how you choose to act. Later that night, a statement from the Springfield Police Department hit the local news. The department has been made aware of an incident involving one of our officers and a visiting federal agent. An internal investigation is underway. We do not condone disrespectful behavior of any kind. Brian saw it flash across the TV screen from his couch. He turned it off, sat there in the dark, and finally realized that for the first time in years, people weren't laughing at his jokes anymore. They were looking at him like he was the problem. But the real reckoning hadn't happened yet, because Marcus wasn't done with him. Not until they spoke face to face. The following afternoon, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the town. Marcus walked up the concrete steps of the police station, holding nothing but a folder in his hand. He wasn't there for paperwork, he was there for closure. Inside, the front desk officer stiffened when he saw him. "Agent Delaney," he said quickly, standing up straighter. "The chief's in his office. Officer Calloway's here too." Marcus nodded. "Good. That's who I came to see." He walked through the hallway, the same one he'd stood in the day before. This time, every officer he passed went silent. No jokes, no smirks, just the quiet awareness that something had shifted. When he entered the office, Brian was already sitting there. His uniform shirt was off, replaced by a plain gray t-shirt. He looked smaller somehow, like the walls had closed in on him. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Marcus stopped just inside the doorway. "Chief?" The chief looked up, nodded respectfully. "Agent Delaney, I'll give you two a minute." He stepped out, shutting the door behind him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The air was thick, the silence heavy. Finally, Brian muttered, "You didn't have to come here." Marcus took a seat across from him. "I did. Because if I didn't, you'd go on thinking this was just about pride or punishment. It's not." Brian rubbed his hands together. "You think I'm some kind of monster?" Marcus's tone was calm, even. "No, I think you're a man who's forgotten what power's supposed to mean. You wear that badge to protect people, not humiliate them." Brian scoffed, but it was weak. "You don't know what it's like, dealing with people every day who don't respect you." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Respect isn't something you demand, Brian. It's something you earn. The moment you think you're owed it, that's when you lose it." Brian looked down, shaking his head. "You know, I didn't even think about what I was doing. It just happened." "Huh. One second I'm joking around, next second I've got a plate in my hand." I don't even know why Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You did it because you could. Because you thought there wouldn't be consequences. That's what power without accountability looks like." Brian swallowed hard. "You're right. The admission hung in the air. Small, but real. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You embarrassed me. You disrespected me. But the truth is, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who gets treated like they don't belong somewhere simply because they don't fit your idea of normal. Brian's voice broke. I never wanted to be that guy. Then stop being him, Marcus said softly. Every day, you get a choice. To listen before you act, to see people instead of labeling them. It's not easy, but it's possible. Brian wiped his face with both hands, exhausted. I lost my badge, didn't I? Marcus shrugged slightly. Maybe for a while. But you've still got a name. What you do with that name next, that's on you. Brian stared at the floor. You're not going to press charges? No, Marcus said. The lesson's already loud enough. The room was quiet again. Then, unexpectedly, Brian stood up and extended his hand. It trembled slightly. I'm sorry. Marcus looked at the hand for a moment, then stood and shook it. Be better. That's all I ask. When he left the office, the chief was waiting in the hall. Everything all right? He asked. Marcus gave a small nod. Getting there. Outside, the clouds finally broke, a thin streak of sunlight cutting through. Marcus stopped on the steps and took a slow breath. Closure wasn't always loud. It was often quiet, like this moment. But Marcus knew one more thing needed to be said, because the lesson wasn't just for Brian. It was for everyone watching. The next morning, the sun rose soft and pale over Springfield. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the smell of dew and gasoline from early commuters heading to work. Life was beginning to move again, but something in the town had shifted. At Dottie's diner, Marlene poured coffee into a half-full mug and looked out the window. The booth where Marcus had first sat was empty again, except for the faint stain she'd decided never to scrub out. A quiet reminder. Dean Whitby sat at the counter reading the local paper. The headline on the front page read, Local officer suspended after incident with federal agent. FBI confirms investigation. Marlene sighed. You think he'll ever come back? Dean looked up. The officer? She shook her head. No. Agent Delaney Dean smiled faintly. If he's smart, he's already on to the next town. People like him don't stay where they're not needed. They go where they can make a difference. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus stood on the edge of a small public park, looking out over a pond. His phone buzzed with a message from his field director. Transfer confirmed. Report to Kansas City next week. He put the phone back in his pocket and watched a group of kids toss breadcrumbs to ducks. Their laughter floated through the air, simple, innocent, unfiltered by judgment. He smiled quietly. Marlene walked up behind him. I figured I'd find you here, she said, handing him a cup of coffee. You left your jacket at the diner. Marcus accepted it with a grin. You didn't have to bring it all the way out here. I wanted to, she said softly. You left something behind. Not just your jacket. He turned to her. What do you mean? She hesitated. People are talking. Not about what you went through, but about how you handled it. You made folks stop and think. Marcus looked back at the water. That's all I ever wanted. They stood there for a moment, quiet, watching the ducks. Then Marlene said, You know, I've worked at that diner 30 years. Seen fights, heard ugly words, but I've never seen someone keep their dignity the way you did. You didn't yell, didn't curse. You just stood tall. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee. Sometimes, silence says more than anger ever could. She smiled, nodded, and patted his arm. You take care of yourself, Agent Delaney. Please, he said with a light laugh. Just Marcus. When she left, Marcus lingered for a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened. He wasn't proud of the humiliation, but he was proud of how he handled it. Because in a world where people too often fight disrespect with violence, he'd chosen restraint, and that choice had changed everything. Back at the police station, Brian stood outside the chief's office, a cardboard box in his hands. Inside were the small pieces of his career, his nameplate, his badge, a framed photo from his first year on the job. The chief came out, sighed deeply. You're a good cop, Brian. You just forgot what that's supposed to mean. Take some time, fix yourself. Come back when you remember why you started this in the first place. Brian nodded slowly. Yes, sir. He left the building quietly, no sirens, no noise, just the sound of his own boots on the pavement. For the first time, he didn't feel like an officer. He felt like a man finally facing the truth about himself. That night, Marcus packed the last of his boxes. As he taped the final one shut, he glanced around the small living room he'd barely had time to settle into. Springfield had tested him, but it had also revealed something deeper. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm in the face of humiliation and let justice speak for itself. He walked outside, took one last look at the street, and smiled faintly. Somewhere behind him, the faint sound of laughter came from a house down the block. Life was still moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, people would start seeing others for who they truly were, not what they assumed them to be. Marcus opened his car door, looked up at the fading orange sky, and whispered, "On to the next." He started the engine, and as he drove away, the sun dipped low, painting the horizon gold. Because respect isn't about fear. It's about seeing someone's humanity before their history. And until we all learn that, nothing changes. If this story made you think, really think, then share it. Talk about it. Teach it. Because the real power isn't in punishing the wrong, it's in helping people understand why it was wrong. Respect starts with awareness, and awareness starts with us.